Hi, I'm Chris the Counsellor, and in today's video we're going to look at, are you ready? The necessary and sufficient conditions of therapeutic personality change. So the necessary and sufficient conditions are basically 6 conditions that Rogers outlined that he said were necessary and sufficient for therapeutic personality change. What I'm going to do in this video is go through each point in a bit of detail to try and explain what each point means and hopefully aid your understanding in seeing the importance of these conditions and what they each mean. Just to help you understand, the 3 core conditions that we usually associate with person-centered counselling came out of these conditions. The core conditions were not actually a term that Rogers used, it was a term that was attributed later on by other writers. But the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions are really the core element of the person-centered approach and outline the only conditions that are needed for therapy to be effective. Okay, let's get stuck in. I know this can sound technical, but stick with me and I'm going to promise that you will have a better understanding by the end of this video. So the first point is that 2 persons are in psychological contact. Now you can go into a lot of depth about this point, about what psychological contact is and isn't, about who can achieve it and who can't, but I'm going to give a very simplistic view of this just for the purposes of this video. What Rogers said about this point is actually he may have even been able to leave it out because it's almost taken for granted that 2 people are in relationship during therapy. That is to say that 2 people are in relationship and they are both impacting on one another. In terms of impact, he's basically just talking about what we're doing and what we're communicating is impacting the other and vice versa. So in simplistic terms, that's what he means by this first point. The second point is the first, whom we shall term the client, is in a state of incongruence, being vulnerable or anxious. What he means by this is referring to his theory of personality, which is that we have 2 main elements to ourselves: our self-concept, which is how we see ourselves, and our experience in the world. What Rogers says is that as these 2 separate and get further apart, then we experience psychological tension or anxiety, and he terms this as incongruence. This means that how we see ourselves and what we're experiencing in the world are kind of disconnected from one another or only overlap slightly, and this is what causes incongruence in the client. There's an incongruence between these 2 elements. So this is all that he means by the second point, is that the client is coming to us in this state. The third point that he makes is that the second person, whom we shall term the therapist, is congruent or integrated in the relationship. What he means by this is that the therapist has a congruent experience. This means that what we're experiencing is not denied, that we're aware of our internal process and that we are not denying this experience or saying to ourselves, I shouldn't have this experience, it's bad so I'll deny it. We're aware of it and we're accepting it. What's an important point to distinguish here is about congruence being communicated. So sometimes we will have an experience inside ourselves and it's enough to just be aware of this and accept this experience into our awareness. There is debate about whether we should share some of these with clients. Rogers even said that if we're continually bored by a client, it may be of some value to communicate this to the client. But that is a whole different video about congruence, what we should communicate and what we shouldn't. But for this point, it's enough to know that this is just not a denial of experience. What is going on inside the therapist is accepted and in awareness. Okay, we're already halfway through, so we've got the first 3 points. And to give a very simple overview, it's basically saying there's two people in relationship, the client is incongruent, so there's a mismatch between their self-concept and their experience, and the therapist is being congruent, so what their experience is allowed into awareness and is not denied. Okay, let's go to the second half. So the fourth point is the therapist experiences unconditional positive regard for the client. Hopefully you're familiar with the term unconditional positive regard. This basically means acceptance or not being judgmental, and this is what we're aiming to offer the client during our therapy sessions. What Rogers is saying in this point is that we are congruently experiencing this acceptance of the client. Now, to link this to the last point, what's important here is that we might have strong reactions to a client or be aware of judgments that we're experiencing. But what's important is that we're aware of this and we create a separation of saying, okay, this is my experience and I accept it, but I'm not going to put this onto the client. So we're not saying or thinking about the client, you should be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. That's what we're trying to avoid when we're offering unconditional positive regard congruently. Okay, the fifth point is the therapist experiences an empathic understanding of the client's internal frame of reference and endeavours to communicate this experience to the client. Let me try and break this down, because actually I think it's simpler than it sounds. So basically the therapist is aiming to understand the client's world as best as possible through the client's frame of reference, which is basically their point of view or their view of the world. So as well as experiencing and trying to build on this understanding of the client, we also endeavour to communicate this to the client. So not only are we feeling that we understand the client, but we're letting them know that we think we understand them and checking out our understanding. This is really where reflecting comes from. This is a way of saying to the client, have I understood that correctly? Have I got the right understanding about how you see the world? We've made it to the last point fairly quickly, I think, so let's go into condition 6. The communication to the client of the therapist's empathic understanding and unconditional positive regard is to a minimal degree achieved. So basically what this last point is saying is following on from condition 5. What it's saying is that not only do we experience acceptance and understanding of the client, not only do we try and communicate this to the client, but also they are receiving these conditions to at least a minimal degree. That is to say that the client feels as though we accept them and understand them. And the only way we can do this is through our communication. So this brings us to the end of the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. Hopefully it's outlined each condition and made it easier to understand. To give you a very brief, simplistic overview of the 6 conditions, Rogers is saying there are two people in relationship. The client is in an incongruent state, the therapist is in a congruent state, the therapist is experiencing unconditional positive regard, so acceptance towards the client. They are also experiencing empathy from the client's point of view and trying to communicate this to the client, and also that the client receives the therapist's acceptance and understanding. This is basically the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions of therapeutic personality change. Maybe a little bit simpler than it first sounds. I hope so anyway. Rogers goes on to say, no other conditions are necessary. If these 6 conditions exist and continue over a period of time, this is sufficient. The process of constructive personality change will follow. One thing I just want to say briefly here, when he says constructive personality change, all he means basically is that the personality structure of the client will change on both a surface level and a deeper level. That is, that there is some change happening in the client. What he's also saying in this quote is that these 6 conditions are necessary, so they are all needed always during therapy, and also that they are sufficient, which is to say that nothing else is needed. These 6 conditions are everything that is needed to make therapy effective. One thing that I think is important to note here is that these conditions, whether we accept them or not, can often be a really good precursor as to whether we follow the person-centered approach or not. As you can see, if you believe that these conditions are necessary and sufficient, then we will be a person-centered counsellor, because we believe this is all that's needed. It leads to a non-directive approach to therapy, and it means that no other techniques or tools are needed. On the other hand, we might think these conditions are necessary but not sufficient, meaning that we need to bring in other tools, techniques or approaches to make the therapy effective. This might be where a therapist moves towards being an integrative therapist or using a different approach altogether. Some other points from the article that I just want to outline briefly is that Rogers is saying that these conditions are not attached to a certain type of client or a certain approach. What he's saying is that these conditions are effective with most types of clients and also within any approach to therapy. Even if we are using tools and techniques, then as long as these conditions underpin the reason for using them, then the therapy will be effective. One thing I want to say here is that in my experience, when people are using tools or techniques or trying to steer the sessions in a certain direction, it isn't usually these conditions which are underpinning it. It's usually that I want to move the client on, I want to make them better, or I want something to happen in the therapeutic relationship, which would no longer follow these conditions and as a result not be person-centered. The other thing that Rogers says is that these conditions are not exclusive to therapy. They may be present in friendships or family relationships, and they are just effective in this setting as well. The only difference is that in these relationships, other things tend to get in the way as well. So people will have opinions or judgments, and then these conditions fall apart. Therapy is probably the most reliable place that we can get these 6 conditions on a consistent basis. So hopefully that's outlined the 6 conditions, helped you understand what each one means, and also shows you the importance of these conditions in the person-centered approach. If you still have any questions or anything you don't quite understand, then please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I'm able. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, then please do so, and most of all, thank you for watching this video.